Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much indeed for joining us today to launch the IFG and Spend Network new report on how the government spends its money. The report, and I won't go on in too much detail about this, but Ian and Tom will. The report has analysed 38,000 transactions that government, sorry, that's not absolutely true, million government transactions between 2012 and 2013 to build up a picture of who the government's biggest suppliers are. And their analysis is really interesting. In many ways, it reveals where the government does spend its money and reveals that the top 20 government suppliers accounted for at least 10.2 billion of government expenditure during 2013. But also in many ways it reveals the inaccuracies of government data and how they are very rich in data but extremely poor in information then with which they can take on different challenges, particularly when it comes to understanding the markets which they're managing, but also in terms of how they go on and procure future goods and services as well. I'm Jim Bly, I'm Head of Public Services at the CBI, so I look after the business to government commercial relationship from the business angle. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to listen to our expert panel, a really strong panel I think, talking about how the government does spend its money with the members of my organisation. For us, transparency is really important. The contracting industry, the outsourcing industry, whatever you want to call it, is actually quite immature. It's actually quite a young industry. For the last 30 years or so, it's grown and it's grown exponentially. Government's ability then to manage markets has also had to grow with that growth in the markets themselves. And over time, I think, we've realised that there are some inadequacies on the government side and inadequacies on the business side, which we absolutely have to address. The first step, I think, to improving that is being more open and being more honest in the procurement process and in the contract management process, and understanding on both sides of the table how the market actually lies, what's in it, who are the players, what are their capacities, and what are their abilities to deliver services for the public. It's essential from our perspective for businesses to be involved in this debate, providers of public services, users of public services, as taxpayers, funders of public services. It's really important that the business view is looked at as well, and that we have a market that delivers for taxpayers, delivers for companies, and delivers for government as well. So we are passionate believers that the business community needs to be more open with the public about how its money is being spent, and that, I think, is taking that data and turning it into information, which hopefully is what we're getting out of this report, which I think is an essential first step today. Joining me on this panel then, we have a really strong set of people who are experts in this particular field. So to my left, we have Ian Makgill, the Managing Director of the Spend Network, and he has been leading on this analysis with the IFG. Tom Gash, Director of Research here at the IFG and co-author of Making Public Service Markets Work, which you can find on the IFG's website. To my right, we have Ollie Buckley, Deputy Director at the Cabinet Office and leader of the Transparency and Open Data team. Ed Green, Deputy Director for EU and Domestic Procurement Policy in the Crown Commercial Service. And Jacqui Taylor, the CEO of Flying Binary and member of the Open Data User Group. And with no further ado, I would like to hand over to Ian.
Thank you. So this report represents just a way station in a 2-year journey that Spend Network has been on, which is simply to understand what happens with public procurement using public data. And it's trying to make sense of that. And the first obvious thing that we need to say is that this isn't possible without the transparency agenda. Without this government's move to open up so much of the information that's available that was previously held in Whitehall and in our councils, we couldn't have started this. And so it's, I personally have a lot to be grateful for in terms of this agenda. And the presence of the Open Data User Group and of the ODI is a testimony to the government's commitment. That said, we've taken 38 million transactions and put them into a database. And that's the easy bit. The hard bit is making sense of it. And that's a journey that we've got a lot of work to do. The idea of sitting here and saying, right, we're going to identify the largest suppliers in government is a much more complex challenge than we had initially thought it would be. The good news is that we've created the most comprehensive publicly available analysis of spending in government. We've got, as I said, more to do. We've got more entities to add to the database, and we've got more analysis to do. But we've made some good inroads. And critical to that has been working in partnership with the IFG, who have helped us understand some of the issues around working with government, and helped us also understand some of the challenges, as well as bringing us to a wider audience. And I owe Tom and Gavin, Nadine and Mark a debt of thanks actually for the effort that they've put into this. We, as part of that process, and actually working with the IFG, we opened up this data and we made it available to the departments and to the companies named in the report. And we've had some approval for the work that we've done, and we've had a couple of items of pushback on the numbers, which I'll talk about in a minute. The one thing that has happened universally, everyone who's come back to us has said, we like transparency. We think transparency is a good thing. And I think that if anyone can take anything away from today, it's that this movement for transparency and more data is, we're only just getting started. One of the realizations is that when we do something like this, you work with new data sets, bringing it together for the first time, that exposing it to scrutiny creates insights that we didn't expect. And we've found some limitations with the data that, I mean, they're to be expected. One of the problems we have is, for example, trying to understand PFI and joint venture. We don't know who the beneficiaries of transactions with some of the operating companies are. That's because we don't necessarily know the percentages of ownership. We don't necessarily know what sort of gain share agreements are in place. And that's something that is a challenge for us. There's another challenge, which is it's very easy to look at a corporate, you know, to have a sense of what they are. If you mention a company like G4S or Serco, you get a sense of what they are. But to understand it in legal terms, so that we understand how much of the transactions coming out of government are going to G4S or Serco, is incredibly difficult. Part of that's due to the limitations in the way we record company data, and part of that's in the limitations of how that data is published. But it makes it very, very difficult. We also had an issue last night where we had some pushback on some of our figures from Hewlett-Packard and the DWP. And when we looked at the way that we'd been matching 38 million transactions against 6.5 million entities, we found a duplication. And that, you know, it's a hard thing to accept, but it's an error on our part. And we have to hold our hands up and apologise for that. And there will be some updates to the report coming out as a result of that. That error also affected Fujitsu. There's a sort of message in this, which is that by the process of using this data and gathering it and putting it out there, we hold ourselves to scrutiny. And that's us as well as the government and the suppliers. And there are good things that are happening here. So, for example, on quite a few of the spend statements, we've been able to go back to the publishers and say, we think there might be an error here. For one example, was the Foreign and Commonwealth Office published some transactions on their facilities management spend. And across 6 transactions, there was a significant inflation with one supplier. So we sent it back to them and said, are you sure this is right? And they went, oh, no, that's Hong Kong dollars. So, you know, this is an iterative process that we've got to use this data, use it in anger, and road test it. And that's what we're doing. I mean, there's also gaps in the data. One of the problems we find is that too many people don't publish data, and also the resource required to gather all of this data just isn't available. So we're constrained there. We will continue to gather data, and we'll look and hope that, for example, Scottish authorities start to publish their spending. I few Welsh authorities do, but we'd very much like them to start opening up more information. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run through the latest figures that we've been working on so that you can see where we are in our findings. So this is our top 20 suppliers listed across 2012 and 2013, and that's central and large local government. So we haven't been able to include district councils in that. One of the interesting things that we found from this research that would probably only be known to employees of Capita is that they actually do more business in local government than they do in central government. So this is the sort of insight that we're able to create using this data. Oh, hang on, we've got a countdown too. And then here's the spend of the 20 biggest suppliers broken down by category. You can see the dominance of IT, slight fall there, but on the third column you can see the outsourcing increasing. So that movement towards continued outsourcing, there was a 23% increase in outsourcing expenditure between the 2 years. Facilities have stayed fairly static, and telecoms also. Where we've seen the biggest falls have been IT and construction. Construction may have been suffering a post-Olympic hangover a little bit as well, given that some of our data covers that period. These are just a breakdown of who the largest suppliers are in IT. Interestingly, you can see that although the grouping, the size of the market has changed, really the shares haven't. So there's not a lot of movement across. These contracts tend to last for a long time. You don't get one down, then another one up. It's a fairly consistent picture. What we do see is that contracts tend to be, with the exception in the IT space, contracts tend to exist with one supplier and one buyer having the bulk of the spend. So if you take Capgemini, for example, they have business in local government, they have business in the rest of central government, but it pales into comparison by their business with HMRC. So 84% of their business is with HMRC. So those are the broad findings that we've been able to look at around the top 20 suppliers. Spend with SMEs, I think, is a really interesting angle that we know that the government has been publishing data, and there's some difficulty for us to replicate that data. It's not possible for us to replicate their analysis. But I think this is, if you look at central government spending with SMEs, look at the massive fluctuations here. It's with only 24 months, we can't spot a trend. And I think that the government's doing a lot of work here. We would like to do more work into this and to try and understand more of what's happening with SMEs, but particularly to see whether policies are having an effect. One of the key things with spending with SMEs does actually come up here, is shown here, and the lower band is the spending by local government with SMEs versus the central government spend with SMEs. Now, central government spends a lot more than local government on things like IT, but actually the local government as a total spends more than central government. So this is to be expected. They've also got that issue where local government is where the rubber hits the road, and you've got to look after smaller items. So it would also make sense that you would use a lot of SMEs. But I think it's quite interesting. The contrast is stark. And the nice thing about, the good thing about this work is that we're able to see insights like this. You know, people knew that local government spent a lot with SMEs, but they couldn't quantify it until now. So really we've got some key findings are the fall in spend with the top 20 suppliers between 2012 and 2013 was higher than the overall fall in spend with companies. So the top 20 suppliers are feeling the pinch, with the exception of the outsourcers. Some of the 20 suppliers, some of those 20 receive most of their business from central government as one department or another. So that reliance on one department is very common. And most of the top 20 are working with central government rather than local government. Now that's understandable because you've got national programs. But the couple of exceptions were Wilmot-Dixon and Capita. So Wilmot-Dixon have a lot of work in local government, and Capita have also extensive work in local government. So those are the key findings. It's my chance to pass on to Tom, who's going to just cover off some of the wider issues around government contracting and what role transparency might have in improving government contracting. I'll try and put the slides back to the title slide.
Very good, thank you, Ian. So it's been a real journey working with Spend Network on this, because it's just such an extensive work, and I don't think Ian actually even laboured enough quite how much time and energy has gone into the work involved in dealing with 38 million transactions and eventually matching them to individual companies and then to company groups and so forth. Some of the work involved in that is extensive. Ian and Spend Network have been working on that for about 2 years. Then we've got the process of validating and checking, which I hope will be an ongoing thing, constantly improving the quality of the data. And I very much hope that we can sit in this room again in 2 years' time and say, actually, everyone around the room knows off the top of their head who the top suppliers are to government because the data is regularly released. And I also hope that some of this data will prompt more government departments to actually publish stuff in an easily digestible format as well as the open data format, showing some of the data that they have internally already to us. The steps that can, I think, be taken quite quickly to facilitate better transparency about government spending with private supplier include lowering the threshold for transactions that are published. So currently it's only transactions over £25,000 that are published. Lowering that to a significant degree would be very, very helpful. I think that has two reasons why that works. One is obviously you just get more data in the database. But the other thing is to note that some smaller organisations, say an NHS trust locally, may only publish 1 or 2 transactions a month over £25,000, and it sort of makes it impossible to know what's going on in that organisation of that scale. So it's limiting where scrutiny can go. A second quick win is very much about getting an established reporting regime for PFI and joint ventures so that we can see the ultimate beneficiaries of this. I think that is one of the next steps. It's not going to be that easy to do, but it is something that needs to be thought about, considered, worked on if this data is really going to be revealing. When we went back to some of the companies, a number of them came back and said, oh, this data is pretty much spot on. The accuracy, there's a little difference here, it's quite small, a few 100,000. It may be to do with the time in which your data comes through versus when we bill it. Other companies, one company and specifically I'm thinking of, came back and said, actually, we've got more income than that. And when we dug into the data, and Ian went with his team and dug into the data, where they seemed to think the difference was in the joint ventures and the PFIs, and that's not surprising to us at all. We really need to get more clarity on how those arrangements work. And the third is to enable some of the cross-referencing and testing that Ian's talking about. Ian and Spend Network, which one thing he didn't mention, he's got algorithms to test big fluctuations in spend month by month to pick up on things like that currency error in the FCO data. Now, there are ways that he could do that more effectively if annual reports, for example, were published in open, machine-readable formats, could start getting better validation and testing, getting more information data out there. But that's just cost. So if I'm going to emphasise we're on a long journey, it's maybe even a longer journey when you start to think about some of the things that the Institute for Government and others, I think, have said is really important to get more clarity on. We need to know much more about the performance of suppliers, their subcontracting arrangement, and contractual terms, where the risks and liabilities lie in contracts, if we're really going to start to have a picture of the value for money that different providers are bringing. One thing I always like to point out was that when G4S and Serco were feeling the heat and public scrutiny and the media were going after them day after day, people would say, well, is it just a few Is it just these companies that are bad apples? And I was very quick to say, well, actually, I don't know that these providers are not performing effectively. I don't know if it's a question of them having particular issues with particular contracts or a more general problem. I don't know whether they are performing better or worse than other providers from the publicly available data. And actually, what you ended up with is a very odd form of accountability, where the crisis is the only thing that matters in terms of accountability, rather than the actual delivery of value for money in the long term. And there could be contracts out there which are massively underperforming at very high cost that we don't know that much about. We really need to focus on this broader picture of transparency. One thing that, and Jim will correct me if I'm wrong here, but the CBI is also interested in, and we're very interested in, is the idea of having a standardised transparency clause that is the starting point for government contracts, where you actually say what will, as a matter of course, be published, how it will be released within the contract, and have that obviously to be much more open than it is now, to allow this kind of work and analysis to happen and to allow us to understand a lot more. I know that on other areas like the FOI, the Information Commissioner's Office is working hard on trying to promote greater transparency around private provider arrangements, on the FOI arrangements, and NAO is pushing on all of these areas, but also on things like open book accounting. And when we sent our report to some of the providers, it was really interesting to see how much of some of the good aspects of transparency and effective contract management and contract relationship with departments was actually already happening. So, for example, Serco cited that 80% of their contracts were on an open book arrangement, so they were sharing full details of sort of costs and revenues with their government purchaser. So we need to do much more on that. I think transparency clauses are a very important way to go. But in other areas, transparency will just be part of the solution. I mean, what we've seen in recent years is serious questions about the effectiveness of contract management and oversight and outsourced provision in certain areas of service. One issue that the Institute's highlighted in past research is competition, making sure there's a diverse range of suppliers so that if one provider isn't up to the job, you can quickly replace them. Having transparency obviously helps you to see how consolidated the supplier base is in certain areas, and that's valuable. It also allows companies to see opportunities to enter into new areas, to see what business is out there. But by itself, that won't be enough. There's got to be, I think, more emphasis on diversity and active management by government. And sometimes this will mean, instead of going directly to one supplier, actually taking on more responsibility itself for using a range of suppliers and ensuring those suppliers are working together and it's coordinating the activities. There was a period that was, I think, for too long, and Francis Maud has talked about this as well, where it was very easy to hand over very big chunks of work to an individual supplier to sort out all the problems for you. And that, while the suppliers could have done a good job in some areas, meant that government lost the capacity to really understand what providers were doing and what value they were bringing. And that sort of slightly too passive approach to contract management is something that really needs to change. It was very well exemplified by the issues around the electronic monitoring contract, where a contract signed a long time ago was slightly forgotten about and irregularities in billing were not picked up. The second issue we've really focused on is much more careful consideration of big outsourcing reforms in the process. Again, transparency could play a part there, because you might say that maybe officials and government ministers would think more carefully about whether their changes are actually going to work if they knew that quickly the results would become transparent. But you need more than that too. We've called for a slowing down of probation outsourcing, and we continue to put pressure on that area. It was interesting to see the FT leader calling for something similar this morning. But we also need stronger central scrutiny around those sorts of major outsourcing problems in these very complex service areas, because we have to recognise the UK is doing some of these things for the first time. Other countries haven't done them before. We need to go carefully, slowly, and learn as we go. Hopefully, transparent data will give us that opportunity to learn about what works, allow the public to put pressure onto government departments, government agencies to answer why they are managing or not managing certain suppliers actively, and hopefully it will lead to better contracting as well as transparency to the public, which you could argue is a good in itself.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Ollie Buckley from the Cabinet Office, over to you.
Great. First off, I'd just like to congratulate Spend Network and IFG on this report. It's exactly the sort of thing that we want to see happening with the data that we're putting out there, and the insight that we can get from outside government to bring back into the way that we make decisions and think about priorities is, as I say, exactly what we're after. I'm going to speak just briefly about what we're doing on transparency and open data a bit more generally, and then Ed is going to speak more to the specifics about transparency on contracts and procurement specifically. And I think it's just worth taking a step back and thinking about the sort of motivations for prioritising this agenda for the government. So back in May 2010, just a couple of weeks after the general election, the Prime Minister wrote out to all central government departments and identified 3 benefits that we were looking to get out of an open data agenda, all of which have got this report has relevance to. So the first was around accountability. So open data shining a light on the decisions that government is making with taxpayers' money and enabling citizens and others to hold government and public bodies to account more effectively. The second around improving public services. So some of that's about identifying where we're using money inefficiently, where there are opportunities to do things better. But it's also about empowering citizens to make informed choices about schools, hospitals, other public services that they consume. And then finally, economic growth. So the idea that businesses can build value on the back of open data. And we have a great example here in Spend Network, also flying binary of businesses that are doing that. Also others like, for example, Citymapper using transport data to do things which provide real benefits to consumers and help inform the way that we manage services. So there's a lot been happening in the 4 years since the Prime Minister sent that letter. Publication of all government spend of over 25k, local authorities down to £500, all government contracts over £10,000 are available on Contract Finder. In data.gov.uk we have arguably the world's leading data portal, which includes over 14,000 data sets now. That's covering all government activity or almost every aspect of government activity. And this is code. The code for that platform is being used by other countries elsewhere in the world, including Uruguay, who football fans may have hoped would have shown more gratitude, but there we go. There's the Open Data Institute, started by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Nigel Shadbolton, helping to support businesses like Spend Network and others to engage with this agenda. And we published the world's first national information infrastructure, which is a first attempt to start identifying what, from all the data holds, from all the data that government holds, are the data sets that are most likely to be driving social and economic value. We've also been playing an active role internationally, and it's worth noting the extent to which the UK is seen as being at the cutting edge of this agenda by our international peers. So under the UK presidency of the G8 last year, for example, leaders signed up to an open data charter which committed all those governments to the principle of being open by default, and included a range of quite specific commitments, including to greater transparency over national budgets. And we have played a leading role in the Open Government Partnership, which was an initiative that we led last year. It's now grown to include 64 countries. And as part of that process, we developed a UK National Action Plan, which set out 21 commitments to transparency across the span of government activity. Now, this plan was co-created with a range of civil societies, including the IFG, And it includes within it a specific commitment that's been mentioned to enhance the contract data that we're publishing. And Ed will tell you a bit more about how we're taking that forward in practice. So we've come a long way, but we know there's a long way still to go. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that we see as priorities over the coming year. So we want to produce a further iteration of the National Information Infrastructure. And in doing so, we want to think about the ways that we can make it, frankly, less of an arduous job to do the sort of analysis that we've seen presented here today. So thinking about the quality of data that departments are putting out, the timeliness of it, also to identify core reference data, the stuff that enables more easily for disparate data sets to be linked across so that you know when people are talking about the same thing. And another big opportunity that we spy is within local government data. There's a lot of activity going on at the local government level in this field, but I think there's a real opportunity to start sharing that learning more effectively and put some real momentum behind it. But I will just hand over now to Ed, who can talk more about the specifics of contract and procurement transparency.
Thank you, Ollie. And I'd like to extend my thanks and congratulations both to Spend Network and the Institute for Government for producing this report. I'm going to reflect a little bit on where we've come from in transparency and contracting, as Ollie have done. And then I'll talk about the formation and purpose of the Crown Commercial Service, which I think will very much help improve transparency and data in this area, and then talk about actions we have in train in the very near term to improve transparency. I think all speakers have referred to us being on a journey, and I think that's very much the case. But isn't it fantastic that we're able to sit here at this event talking about a report based on the analysis of 38 million government transactions? I mean, if you'd have said that 5 years ago, so notwithstanding there's more to do, I just think it's worth reflecting how fantastic it is for us to be able to do that today. 4 years ago, we had very little idea about our spend with our strategic suppliers, let alone manage them as a single customer. Now we've got a much better handle on that through our network of Crown representatives who own those relationships, and also through the data that we publish. Ollie's mentioned the requirement for central government to publish contracts worth over £10,000 on Contracts Finder, with around 20,000 contracts to date. But probably as important, certainly in terms of diversifying the supply base, which is what Tom touched on, is the fact that we also publish opportunities over £10,000, and even more than that, we publish possible opportunities. So what might we buy in the medium term, over the next 2 to 3 years, which SMEs told us was important, so that they're able to gear up and deliver our requirements. If they see a contract opportunity, then it's very much more difficult for them to gear up if not already prepared, or to form consortia. So there's a range of data on Contracts Finder outside of just simply the signed contracts. Talking about the move to the Crown Commercial Service then, Crown Commercial Service brings together the buying arm, the Government Procurement Service, with the procurement policy teams in Cabinet Office, and with departmental procurement teams responsible for purchasing common commodities. And it'll also create a complex transactions team that will help departments on common but quite complex requirements in negotiating those deals with suppliers. Now, why I think that's important is that one of the key differences between the Crown Commercial Service and its predecessor is that it won't just put in place framework agreements for other people to use. It'll actually move towards offering a fully managed service, which means it'll let the frameworks or other contractual routes, but it will then source off those frameworks for its customer departments. I think the report touched on the fact that actually we had little visibility of framework spend, either publicly or in the centre. And that should really help the centre have a much better understanding of where money's flowing, enable us to get much better market intelligence coupled with the network of Crown representatives, obviously looking after our strategic suppliers. Now, this report is very timely. Tom has alluded to calls from others, from Institute for Government for greater transparency, as has Jim from the CBI. You may have seen that the Public Accounts Committee published a report back in March where they called for a number of improvements to government contracting to make it more transparent around FOI, government getting greater transparency from its suppliers through the greater use of open book. And we published our response to that report last Thursday. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you take a look, because it sets out some of the actions we have underway to make government contracting even more transparent. Following a round table co-chaired by Francis Maud and John Cridland from the CBI back in May, we've established a working group of government and suppliers, and that's going to aim to draft a set of transparency principles. You know, clearly, government wants to see as much information related to the performance of contracts as possible disclosed. So to test that, we're going to work up this set of transparency principles that we aim to launch in the autumn, so that we have better data from our suppliers in terms of what government's being charged. We're going to also, well, we have launched a 6-month trial of greater use of open book provisions. These are used very much in other areas of government at the minute, including in the MOD, but we want to run this trial with a view to mandating open book on major contracts, subject to what the trial shows us. We're also working on a code of practice with MOJ relating to the Freedom of Information Act. So that code of practice will be consulted on in the summer and launched later in the year, in the autumn, with a view to to make sure that private providers are cooperating with their public sector clients in releasing information that can be requested under the Freedom of Information Act. So I think it's great that we can sit here and discuss this report today. As I say, government is keen to see even more transparency in government contracting, and I very much look forward to hearing the views of the room in how we take this very important agenda forward.
Ed, thank you very much. And finally to Jacqui Taylor.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm a web scientist, and at Fine Binary we change the world with data to build the web that we want. So we're very much engaged on the citizen enablement portion of that journey, and I sit here as a data journalist first, but also as a member of the Open Data User Group. And Fine Binary supplies all our data platforms via the G-Cloud program, so we're in your data somewhere, Ian, I expect. Yep. And excellent. And I want to add my congratulations. I think Open data is at the heart of everything we do at Fine Binary, because we believe in the mission, the transparency mission. We know what it can unlock, and certainly to see the Open Government Partnership piece actually unlocking that value across the world, and the emergence of civil society backing that agenda is huge as far as we're concerned. And over 3 years ago at Fine Binary, we were credited with co-creating the data journalism industry with the editor of The Guardian, and all of that work has started with open data. We were very much focused on the global issues, and as data journalists, what we do is we take that data and we understand the stories that are embedded in it, and we publish those to allow citizens to interact and to enable us as journalists to understand where their view of the stories are. And data journalists from those days 3 years ago, we've been pioneers in using open data as part of that enablement, part of that storytelling, and we've got some very ambitious plans going forward, and I'll give you a sneak peek of that. But the first data journalism story was based on our scientific work as web scientists, something called visual analytics, and it surfaced the story of the human cost of the war in Afghanistan using the WikiLeaks data. And that is still there today for you to see, embedded in the Guardian platform, hosted on our free public G-Cloud platform. And prior to loading that story as journalists, because I'm not a journalist, I'm a web scientist, but I worked in the newsroom at the Guardian, was, does anybody care? And actually 2 hours later, 34 million people cared. So one of the reason that this is so important is people care. And actually we have 3,000 analysts across the world. If we need something doing, we reach out and they help. So from a citizen point of view, they're never going to be the data literate, data geeks that we all are, but they're interested and they care. And that was the beginning of a 2-year open data collaboration with The Guardian, which ended in January. Because in January what we did was, as we got together in the summer, the data journalists, and decided it was time to shift the agenda. So we published a book in January. The Media Society helped us with that, and we told the world that that agenda was over, and here we are, we're moving on. And since the publication in January, we've got 4 universities changing all their courses around what we're planning to do. 2 national newspapers have launched interactive newsrooms as a result of the book. And as data journalists, we're moving the agenda on to ensure open data is the heart of everything that we do. The Open Data User Group and my role in that, as members, we're all appointed as independent policy advisors on the open data agenda, and independently report, obviously work with Ollie and the team on the day-to-day, but independently can have a view on the agenda. And one of the things we did in the very beginning was we needed to dispel some of the myths. We needed to challenge the supply-led approach to open data. This is a transparency agenda. Departments, give us everything you've got. Because actually we know from working as data journalists that citizens have a view as well. Data companies have a view. Researchers have a view. The voluntary sector has a view. So we set about on the Open Data User Group to actually evidence that view. And Flying Binary worked with the data.gov.uk team, and we actually embedded that view in the home of open data for the UK. And we created the evidence for a new form of open data that we call demand-led. And I think really what you're doing with this report is actually bringing that front and centre as well, because I'll be interested to see who consumes what you do and the stories that build on it. There are journalists in this room. I'll expect you all to at least write one story. And so we have something that the Open Data User Group is known for, which is something called a roadmap, which is based on that demand for open data. That again is hosted on Flying Binary's free public G-Cloud platform, because this agenda needs to be made as wide as possible. Now, before Open Data User Group did what they did, only 40 people were generally connected with this agenda on a daily basis. We're almost 2 years on, over 9,000 people have interacted and commented and engaged with that agenda via the changes that we've made to data.gov.uk as Open Data User Group. I think the interesting thing is that 10% of those people that get actively involved in that agenda go on to request data, go on to evidence further need and further use. And some of those people are citizens who want to see stuff. Some of those people are data specialists like ourselves. And one of the things I'd say is go on data.gov.uk, data request, there's a button, get some data. And literally anybody in the room, anybody in the country that knows where the need is for open data, that's what we're about as part of the Open Data User Group. One of the things we wanted to do was we wanted to dispel some of the myths and the views around what was happening with open data, why people need it, what do they use it for. What we found over the time we've evidenced is that it's predominantly used by individuals. However, that's changing dramatically over this year. But we've evidenced 7 areas across policy that actually relate to this agenda. And one of the interesting things is one of the increasing user bases for open data from a demand point of view is the public sector itself, which we didn't see at all in the beginning. Bringing it back to the report today, almost 10% of every data request we've ever had relates to the spending data that you're talking about. So does it matter? Do people care? Is this important? This report is at the heart of what we're doing in the transparency piece, heart of what we're doing at Open Data User Group. One of the urban myths about open data when people said, oh, they're not using it because it's a quality issue. Not true. It needs to be machine readable? Yes. Possibly it locks other people out if they can't do what Spend Network and Flying Binary do? Yes, true. However, there were 3 main barriers to open data. There was licensing issues, particularly for commercial use, particularly for downstream. The cost of it, I don't need to mention the data set I'm talking about. Too expensive as a Tech City mentor for any of my 1,200 plus Tech City companies to go buy a copy. And the one we're talking about today, which is about unreliability. Unreliability in the widest sense of the word. How, you know, what is there, as Ian said, some of the data's missing. Some of the problems are an ambition on the department's agenda to publish as often as they can. What we've evidenced at the Open Data User Group is publish it on a regular cycle. People can consume it, and we can automate on the back of that as entrepreneurs. If you can only do it once a year, do it regularly once a year, tell us when it's going to happen, tell us what's going to be in it. We can get to the once a month and every day if that's what you're trying to do, but let's make sure it's reliable. Now, I'm not sure it's really been mentioned today, but the Open Data User Group, as part of a release of data fund, has recently funded the Open Data Institute to produce a set of materials for procurement officers to back the agenda that Ed's talking about, where we actually tackle the underlying problem that Ian and IFG have experienced. And that includes the transparency clauses you asked for, Tom. So that's part of it. So that work has been funded. All the blogs and the news on that is going out soon, but essentially that has been agreed by the Public Sector Transparency Board. There's still lots to do. I mean, you've done some great work, you know, IFG and Spend Network, but there's lots to do. And I think we've yet to realise the full value of what's possible, and you've alluded to some of that as well. But from my point of view, this report is a landmark in that it underlines why the transparency agenda has to happen. It underlines that citizens care about their stuff, and actually we all work together to get to a better result for all of us, because we're all citizens.
Thank you very much, Jacqui, and to all of the panel. Before I open to the floor for questions and for comments and for discussion, I have a couple of questions. Jacqui and Ollie in particular. The Prime Minister said that he wanted the public to be able to make better informed decisions about the quality of the services they use and the types and nature of the services they use. It seems, though, that citizens care, but the data that we're seeing from IFG and Spend Network shows that we won't actually be able to necessarily understand it. How can we really get to the point where the public can make those informed decisions with the information that's coming out? Ollie first, if that's all right.
Well, and so, I mean, the short answer is that there's roles both for us and for those that sit outside government. So, part of what we're trying to do is improve the quality of the information that's coming out, and to encourage those that produce it to be more thoughtful about the ways in which it may be used once out. And I think that we're at an early stage in this agenda, and I think that that there's a big learning curve there. That to some extent we've been very successful in getting a large volume of data out, perhaps. But acknowledge that there's a long way to go to get a full understanding from the data owners of its potential. But we do and will always, to an extent, rely on expert intermediaries to help extract the most value out of the data. And so that means there will always be a role for the likes of Spend Network and Flying Binary here. There will be an important role for the media as well, in terms of interpreting things like school exam results, like hospital performance data. The important thing is to make sure that we are giving them access to the raw material they need to bring that insight out.
So with my Open Data User Group hat on, one of the things that's changed once we evidenced what the barriers were, once we understood what needed to be done over this last year, is we've actually worked directly with the relationship managers and the transparency team, and we've created a set of practitioners and champions inside the departments who get this agenda, who are actually wildly excited about this agenda. That's quite scary when it's a statistician or an operational researcher, but it's a good thing. And the thing is about it, one of the things that's become apparent is moving this agenda forward is actually making the case for those people who own the data, who do the primary purpose of this data is to run the government services, understand it's got value beyond that. And I'm excited as an ODUG member to see people like the Health and Social Care Information Centre looking at our demand-led roadmap to see who's asked for what. And then by the time the relationship manager or one of the ODUG team goes in, they go, already in the roadmap, anything else you need? And so we've now got a handful of departments who are preempting anything that we get to do by already being on the agenda. And that's fantastic for the whole agenda, but it's great to see it's not an isolated thing, and we're all working hard to help people understand that. And I think that's our next push. So that Ollie mentioned the National Information Infrastructure. We'll have some big news on that this year, and that builds on that work that's been done. And I with the work that we're doing on that, I do believe that that's the next way in which we can engage that debate, because it's an enormous set of things that we're out to do, but there are some core things we have to make a case for and move things on. And so I believe that the local agenda that we're doing, and in a particularly targeted way, and the National Information Infrastructure is the way in which we get the purpose of that agenda over and get that groundswell of people who understand that the things they do every single day matter to all of us.
Thank you. I'm interested in markets. We know Tom is interested in markets as well, and government, of course, are managers of many different markets. My question for Ian and Tom and for Ed is how you can transform this data into a management information tool so you can more effectively manage the market and understand, particularly at central government level, I think, where you're a bit further away from the delivery model itself, you can understand exactly what's going on in the market. Tom?
Well, one thing to say is that government has more data than we have from the public domain, and one would hope, and from various conversations I know, that some departments have reasonably good data on who their providers are, how much they're spending on them, and contracts. It's not always across the board. Sometimes it's particularly to do with particular contracts. Now, one thing, that's the reason we're pushing for transparency, standards of transparency more widely on performance, cost, subcontracting arrangements, is so that you can start to get that information that departments hold themselves automatically as a matter of course out into the public domain. Very interesting example of this and how it could be, and why more standardisation is needed, is the work programme. So getting people back into work. There's data out there on performance. Credit to DWP. It lists its suppliers and it says how many people have they got back into work. We don't actually know, however, we can't match up the spending against the performance. These providers receive slightly different money. And so what do you get then? Well, you get a position where potentially one provider's not doing quite a good job, but is much, much cheaper, but you don't know about that. But that's an example of a department that's already going, in that contract, doing quite well at being a bit transparent about it, could have done better. Another thing to note in relation to the work programme that is important is that they delayed publishing data on the performance of the work programme for a long period of time, and that was something that caused political pain, I think. Because there wasn't transparency about the results as they were coming in, and there was a long delay before publication, there was a sort of sense in the commentariat community, something is wrong here, what's going to happen when they release the data? And they release the data, and suddenly there's a story. Whereas if you continually release the data as you go, people familiarise themselves with it, they say, oh, it's too early to judge this programme at this stage, and they will gradually form and change their opinions as they go along. So there's something to be said for regular data releases on performance and cost. So I think, in answer to your question, releasing what they already have is a good start, and having greater clarity and standards about what good looks like and communicating that across the piece will be a good first step.
I think on the work programme point, just to add to that, I think providers were frustrated that they had all this information, they were supplying it to DWP, yet DWP weren't letting it be published. I think providers want to be able to tell the good story and tell stories which aren't so good as well. But they want to be able to release this information, but government departments, please let them do this. Ed, over to you, and then to Ian.
Thanks. I think the data's critical, absolutely critical to our ability to be able to manage markets. I think it's something that the Crown Commercial Service move is going to help with, where we'll have commercial intelligence function, that'll be able to look at the spend that's going through essential deals. It'll be able to take data from the pre-procurement engagement that we very much encourage all government departments and indeed ourselves to do, to learn who the key market players are, what our spend in those markets looks like, what our dependency looks like, and again, important to use the Crown Representatives Network, looking after the strategic suppliers for that. I think one interesting tool for managing markets, or at least for managing your place in a market, that's sometimes a bit overlooked, is open book. Because what can happen sometimes is that historically we've gone out to tender for something and we've got X number of bids back and we've taken the best bid out of X number of bids without always appreciating whether that constitutes market rates. But if we know what the should cost answer is through better use of open book, then we can obviously get much sharper at preparing for our future procurements for similar services, for budgeting for those procurements, for engaging with the market intelligently and commercially, and knowing whether what answer we get back is the right answer.
Yeah.
Of course, I would argue actually that the website as it is already a tool. I would say that, wouldn't I? But then, it's a very simple thing, for example, is that now it's not possible for you to accept your 3 references from a supplier. If you're a buyer and they give you 3 references, you think, well, they're going to tell me a good story. But you can go to Spend Network, type in the supplier's name and see everyone they've done business with in central and local government. And that's got to be a start, hasn't it? So we've got, I think we've got a very long way to go. A lot of it is category specific. What does value look like in mobile phones versus social care? We can't, there's a lot of tertiary data around something complex like provision of social care that to get to the bottom of creating a tool that manages that market, I think would be very, very complicated. Yeah. But creating a tool that allows us to manage a mobile phone or a telecoms market, very simple. We've just got to take the steps.
Thank you. Over to you, ladies and gentlemen. Sir.
Alan Howarth. 20 years ago, I was tabling questions in the House of Commons about government contracting. I particularly wanted to know how the Department of Social Security, as it was called in those days, was setting about seeking tenders from outside contractors, private contractors, for the delivery of public services or parts of public services. These were public services to be funded by the taxpayer. I wanted to know about how the contract was going to be structured and so forth. And at that time, I was routinely fobbed off with the commercial and confidence mantra. It's very good to know that 15, 20 years on, the government has a strong commitment to transparency. But I'd like to ask 2 questions. One is, are there any categories of information that the government still refuses to be transparent about that we actually need to know about if we're to hold the government to account for its performance in this area? And secondly, is there any advice that you can give to Parliament as to how it might better fulfil its vital function of scrutinising the use of the taxpayers' money? The Public Accounts Committee is high profile, wonderfully served, as far as I can judge, by the National Audit Office. But the Public Accounts Committee looks at events ex post facto, and it looks at things that have gone wrong. And so we get a folklore of continuous disaster, which is probably extremely unfair. So we don't get balanced coverage, and that distorts the politics of it. But MPs now, I think, who are not on the PAC and supported by the National Audit Office, just as was the case with me 20 years ago, lack the expertise and resources to perform their responsibility. And I wonder how you would advise Parliament to strengthen its performance.
Thank you very much. Jacqui, the first question on categories that the government refuses to publish that could be useful. Over to you.
I think this is where I was talking earlier about the National Information Infrastructure. As a web scientist, data is the fuel of our future digital economies. And at the heart of that is something that we consider core. So I'm a banking specialist. I built the infrastructure for the Bank of England. I shifted it as well when we did the disaster recovery piece. And I would not have been, I would have expected that was sort of curated as the crown jewels. And as a web scientist, I expect that of data. In today's economy, data is part of our national infrastructure, and that's not where we are. And so I have to say at the heart of that is the battle that ODUG has had to do over the last 2 years to get addressing open. As digital companies, that core reference data is vital. Location is the future of all of our work. So I'm sure there are sighs across government every time in ODUG we have another front on which we battle for the core reference data. But the battle goes on because it's vital to everything that we do. So I hope that everybody will look out for the work that we're doing, join in and help us make the case for that core reference data to be available to all at the point of consumption or free. And I would say that, Ollie, wouldn't I?
Ian.
I think, you know, the first and most important thing to recognise is that there is way more to celebrate about what has been made available than there is to you know, data whining is a mode that I can fall into very quickly, and I try and stop myself from doing it, so whining about so-and-so ex-council data or whatever. I think there's generally my feeling has been that there isn't anything that government is obdurately refusing to publish openly. Obviously there was the postcode data and some of those sort of things that I see as been and gone. Right now, I don't think there is anything around the procurement space that they are really objecting to. There are improvements to be made around regularity, quality. I think some of, you know, when we start to look at some of this, we're going to see that, you know, Council X seems to publish 30% less than Council Y, but they spend 5 times more. What's going on here? You know, there's a lot of that sort of thing to work out. So overall, I would say it's a positive. In terms of advice to Parliament, I think that your analysis of this is we end up in a negative spiral of only watching the bad things happen around whichever contract it is with whichever supplier. I think that's absolutely spot on. And part of the problem is that, you know, council does a really good job, doesn't sell many papers, does it? You know, government department does an amazing job, doesn't sell many papers. So I don't think that you'll break out of it. I think there is some time to look very closely at the data, to use predictive analytics, to start looking very closely at what is happening to prices and to monitor demand. We've really only just scratched the surface of what's possible here. And, you know, I'll give you a very quick example. Recruitment. Local government put some large framework contracts together for recruitment, temporary staffing. What we've seen in our data in the last few months is that there's an increasing number of suppliers of spending going outside of contracts by local government. When we had a chat with some of the suppliers, they said, yeah, that's because social workers are able to get so much better pricing by going outside the contract, so they're earning more. So if you push too hard in certain places, you know, things squash out. So I think understanding demand would be a really useful way to go.
Thank you. Tom?
So this is an excellent question, and I'm going to be a bit more blunt, which is to say that actually there are many good reasons why government doesn't want to publish some of the information of the types that we would like to see, that would allow effective scrutiny for parliamentarians and the media and others, when we talk about trying to get more transparent information about cost, performance, subcontracting arrangements, I think what's shifted is that many departments accept that in principle, but the question for them is partly timing. When is the right time to show how well this system overall, or this outsourcing arrangement overall is doing? It goes back to that DWP example. It's quite hard to say from the beginning, I'm going to show you, knowing all of the implementation issues I'm going to have, delivering a fast-scale program at big, at high cost, knowing there's going to be some IT glitches early on that staff have got to get up to speed. It's very hard to say early on, I'm going to show you all of those workings. And so there is, it does take courage, leadership, astuteness, but it also takes a binding commitment to be made by someone at some point in time. This is why I think the transparency clauses could be the thing that does that. In the same way, in a sense that the data was opened up by the commitment to publish spend over £25,000, another commitment is needed to say we will sign up to this as our standardised transparency clause. The commercial in confidence thing is something that frustrates me personally because it's clearly applied far too broadly in many circumstances, and I'm sure that Ed would be very good at giving the reasons, the exact occasions when it is essential and important to have that. But I think they're far fewer, and the answer that something can't be released because it's commercial in confidence is often a convenient cover for this. In terms of Parliament, the analysis is, of course, spot on, and it goes back to the point that I made earlier, which is even when they're being questioned, many of these providers are not able to say, well, have you seen the performance overall versus these guys over here? This is how I'm doing on my other contracts. Even that would help. But then you then have to look into questions of committee structure, committee supports, use of specialist advisors on committees and so forth. Dr. Hannah White, who was a clerk in the Commons, is currently here on secondment at the Institute for Government, having a look at some of the innovations in parliamentary scrutiny and trying to understand exactly how scrutiny could move more in the direction that you're talking about, which I think would be a really positive and important development.
And finally, before I take more questions, Ed.
Thanks, Jim. I've got a good deal of sympathy with the question around data being withheld for commercial confidentiality reasons, and that's one of the reasons for revisiting the code of practice on the Freedom of Information Act, because we think, tactically at least, that reason has been deployed probably more often than it should have been. Now, whether that's by the public body with the information or the private provider, it is sort of by the by, and we want to get much greater consistency around what is and what isn't disclosed, and making sure that where information is withheld, it is for genuine commercial reasons. So if disclosing it might infringe a supplier's intellectual property, for instance. As for the transparency clause as well that Tom mentioned, couldn't agree more, and that's one of the things that we're looking at in the National Action Plan, the development of such a transparency clause. There's something already in our model services contract, but we want to make sure that that genuinely works, and we're talking to many of the civil society consultees on the National Action Plan about making that effective.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take two questions this time. The lady at the front and the lady over on the side.
Hi. Tom mentioned that contracting out has an important role for the contracting process, for the whole tendering process and the contract management. Could you please clarify the importance of the transparency for the tendering process particularly?
Okay.
Hi. Building on from that, actually, I'm curious about where the cost burden of transparent, reliable data would lie, because if it lies within government in times of austerity, where's that money going to come from? And if it lies with the business, when you've already got a top 20 providers, is that going to discourage SMEs from trying to get contracts?
Well, I feel this is a question I should answer. Okay, thank you very much. In that case, Ollie and Tom to answer both of those questions.
Sorry, and I didn't quite...
The first question is on the importance of transparency in the tendering process, and the second question is about who bears the costs.
Sorry, both probably better directed to Ed.
Absolutely fine. Ed and Tom.
That's right. In the importance of transparency in tendering, one of the issues we had when we launched our SME procurement programme back in 2010 was that business didn't know where to go to find opportunities. So some of them were available on paid-for websites, some of them on departmental websites, some of the below threshold ones, there was very little visibility indeed. So advertising all opportunities over 10,000 in central government meant that those businesses were able to find opportunities free of charge in one place. We published the tender documents as well as the opportunities so that people can see what went into our procurement documentation, and also publishing contracts as well as helping people know who we've contracted with and for how much can help subcontractors identify who a winning prime contractor is, and then talk to them about winning that business. I think the cost of transparency is an interesting point. Obviously, I think transparency in itself can have some price benefits. If people see what government's paying for what, and government can see what other parts of the public sector is paying for similar services, then I think that can have a positive impact on costs. Clearly, the better the systems, the more regular the types of disclosure, and the easier it is to publish that data, then those costs are going to reduce. We haven't had much pushback from SMEs about transparency in particular. Certainly on the transparency of opportunity side, clearly they're very supportive, but we haven't had a great deal of pushback in terms of publishing contracts.
Tom?
I completely agree with Ed's point, which I think is quite important, that transparency can potentially have price benefits. I think for too long, some government departments or some procurement professionals have felt that if they keep all the information to themselves, they can win against the suppliers. That we can play them off against each other, we can get the best deal if we just keep this to ourselves. Whereas actually sometimes that's not the case, and there are very many different ways of getting a good price, and transparency could be one of them. In terms of the importance of contracting, of transparency during the tendering process, I mean that would be probably the key point. But who bears the cost of transparency? Another point. But just going back to a much more important point, I think, for SMEs than advertising opportunities. People tend to find opportunities where there is money in it, and they can develop the networks and relationships to find out about them. But when you structure a deal such that a small provider can no way take on the risk or the volume of the work, that's the thing that ultimately discourages people from entering the market. So if you have a single national contract for court translation, for translation services to courts, well, that's bad for many reasons, partly because it stops small companies from competing, but also it means that actually you end up with one supplier where you could have many generating different ideas and competing and improving. So I think that actually structuring the deals correctly, building commissioning skills, some of the stuff that the Commissioning Academy is doing important. I think the Crown Commercial Service could be very important in here. I would encourage, I think, the Crown Commercial Service, the Treasury, to take some of the principles that are being used for the basic transactional expenditure on things like phones, IT, etc., and start looking at the really high value areas of public service expenditure. Start to apply some of the same principles and expertise around things like the work programme, around things like the Academies programme, because at the moment I feel it's good that we're starting with the commodity, better purchasing of paper through to IT equipment, but someone needs to be doing more at that high value end as well.
Ian?
A very quick thing on value. The people who use our site the most, who log in the most, local government members and members of the Crown Commercial Service. So, actually, both of those groups really care about reducing costs. Yeah. So the actual idea that transparency has it has an upfront cost because someone has to publish a Excel file or a CSV file every month. But really, when it comes down to it, the openness and the transparency drives down costs because more people, they don't get fobbed off, they know what's going on, and suppliers also are exposed to greater scrutiny.
That's right. Okay, I'll take two questions again. Lady there, put your hand up first, and the gentleman over there.
Hi, Charlotte GM from Computer World. I suppose a point and a question. Firstly, I'd quite like to see a distinction drawn between open data, which I feel the government has made huge strides in, and transparency, because they're quite different things. Open data, great, there's a huge amount of data released. If I go to a department and I ask them who has just won a contract that I know has just been awarded, they won't answer. So to hear talk of transparency is frankly laughable in my job. Yes, transparency of the tendering process would be a nice idea. And also, you know, we talk about kind of people making informed choices based on data, which is fine, but, you know, we've just seen all the staffing data from the NHS released. That's all well and good, but what does a person do with that data? They can't go to a different hospital. Surely the data should be used by the public sector to improve its own services. So my question is that happening already? And if not, how can we have a mechanism for open data being used, you know, consuming its own data, basically?
So, can you say your name and where you're from?
Yes, Christopher Foster, Better Government Initiative. Marvellous stuff and wonderful to hear. When you think of PFI and PPP in the past, what strides we are making. I'm slightly surprised in a way. There are lots of areas where just comparing costs will take you most of the way you want to go. There are other areas where benefits do need to be calculated, and I would like to believe that in a great many areas of government there are sufficient concepts of benefit that you could actually use them, identifying the beneficiaries shouldn't be all that difficult. I hope that's true. But even then, you have tremendous problems because of differences in service in different parts of the country. You take the DWP and job centres, depending on how much the population is out of work and what sort of jobs are available, so on and so forth. You've got lots of differences of that kind. And my second question is, you've also got to cope with politicians and changing their minds, changing their policies. Haven't we just heard, for example, I think that the Labour Party has said, maybe even Miliband said it, that if there were to be a change of government, then you could expect quite a lot of the contracts which have been to be torn up, that they simply wouldn't observe the contracts which are made by this government necessarily in the next government. How do you deal with that sort of problem? And I suppose the very last thing is, you've talked almost entirely about simultaneous comparisons. What about, are we moving towards something more ambitious in terms of saying that when you put something out for contract, you try and describe in some detail what it is you're putting out for contract, then do a sort of impact assessment of a rather detailed kind, so that you can get a prediction from whoever wins the contract of what is it likely to spend. I mean, are you that ambitious too? Okay,
thank you. Ian?
So on the issue of transparency, I think that I would say that there's a sort of clash of cultures, really, around governments, the management of some, you know, it's very easy to look at government as a sort of homogenous beast, and it's not. And I think you'll probably find that some press offices are much more helpful than others, and those sort of things. And that's certainly our experience. And actually, there are some people who don't understand open and don't understand transparent. On that specific point about who's going to win a tender, we're hoping that Ed's work on Contracts Finder will benefit our site, that you won't have to go and call the press office, because actually, as soon as it happens, the data's up there. So I'm not saying how long that will be, you know, I know there's, you know, but I do know from meeting with Ed's team and the work that they're doing at Crown Commercial Service that is definitely the intent. So, you know, the idea that you have to wait to find out what's going on shouldn't happen. I'm going to hop to the benefits issue and the issue is understanding value, that nebulous term, and what is the delivery of value, is the sort of thing that doesn't get done by data around money. It gets done by data around, okay, how many people were unemployed versus how many people are now in employment. It gets done by saying how many people with drug abuse issues are no longer are now in employment. So actually how we calculate benefit from contracting means addressing a whole array of different pieces of data and linking them back, as Tom was mentioning, on the work programme, linking them back to the contracts. You know, I think
more sophisticated than that. There are more sophisticated techniques.
Well, exactly. I mean, and this is outside of my remit. I'm just a procurement geek. Give me bank statements any day. You know, that I understand those. So I think basically, it's a really difficult thing to do, is what I would say, and we're only the start of it. We can't pertain to get it right, and we couldn't. I don't think we exist to put that sort of data out. As for politicians and then changing their minds, I would say that I kind of blame I blame Kennedy actually. He said we'll go to the moon in however many years. I think it was 5 years or something, knowing full well that it was achievable. But I think too many politicians work on the basis that if I utter, it will happen. And actually, one of the things that data can show is that plenty of initiatives have failed. And hopefully what we can start to do is bring more transparency to endeavour, expenditure and failure and linking those together. That might curb some of their ambition.
Thank you. Okay, and then Ollie and Ed are going to split this between you and Jacqui, and then we'll have 2 more questions and that's us done.
So just to respond to the first question, I mean, on the transparency versus open data distinction, I think, well, Ian's point is one that I sort of absolutely support and recognise that, you know, this is a massive culture change piece, and we are progressing at different paces in different places, but the direction of travel, I think, is very clear. And what we see from steps like, for example, the publication of the major project authorities' RAG ratings for major projects. Now, you know, I mean, clearly there were sort of a range of views on the wisdom of doing that, but actually, once done, those that feared the worst actually see, as Tom was saying earlier, that early sharing with the outside world about how a project progressing actually rather tends to reduce the temperature of debate rather than increase it. And then the second point about how this is or is not driving improvement and choice in public services. Well, actually, you're right to point out, and I should have been clearer about the value of this agenda back into the way that the services themselves are managed, and how managers and ministers use this to inform them. But you know, one of the shining examples of in the early part of this agenda was the publication of mortality rates and hospital success rates by cardiac surgeons that saw dramatic increases in the quality provision. So, and that approach is being extended out into other parts of the health service and indeed into other parts of the of public service delivery, and is showing real demonstrable improvements in quality.
Thanks. In response to Charlotte's question, I'm going to have to ask Ian to refrain from chuckling at this response. But obviously, public bodies are theoretically required to publish award notices, which sets out who has won a contract. I mentioned Ian because I know he's been trying to do work on measuring procurement timescales, which is very difficult when award notices are routinely not published. That requirement will actually be tightened under the new procurement directives that my team's currently implementing. So I think they'll have 30 days to publish the award notices, down from 48. I mean, if the procurement's not in a standstill period and the contract has been awarded, and it's not one of those secret contracts that's exempted from the standard procurement rules, then there's absolutely no reason at all why you shouldn't be able to find out who it's been awarded to. I mean, on the impact assessment point as well, from the second questioner, I mean, procurement projects are supported by business cases, but wouldn't it be great, as I alluded to earlier, if you could use some of the data that we had in government to work out what a service that you're buying should cost, rather than waiting for your bids to come in and then picking the best value out of that limited number of bids instead of having some actual market intelligence at your fingertips. So I think with greater use of things like open book, with better data sharing inside government, government should have a much better idea of what projects should end up and services contracted for should end up costing.
Jacqui.
So I think from my point of view, I gave evidence to the Public Account Select Committee on the Open Data Agenda, and the basis of that evidence was I've trained 500 data specialists across government without government knowing. And so I was able to say the data literacy across government needs to be raised. And I think that needs to be raised across the board. And so our work continues, and at some point it might connect with another agenda, but just right now we're doing our bit. And I think that is true. We've obviously evidenced at Flying Binary the citizen and how we can enable the citizen to be empowered in this. And the civil society piece that Ollie mentioned is actually really important to that, because that is being taken very seriously as part of the transparency agenda. But you're right, Charlotte, that the open data agenda lets all cheer, but actually what we're really moving towards, or we should be moving towards, is open policy, because that's where transparency really starts to make a real dent in everybody's agenda, because we've actually got a groundswell of people across the piece that are interested in whichever area we're looking at and level of scrutiny we're looking at next. And so from a transparency point of view, what we do at Flying Binary, what the Open Data User Group's attempting to do, is make opinion redundant and evidence to be the way forward. And if we can marry that with data literacy, we can move move the open data agenda to an open policy agenda where we've got more people involved in it. What we'll actually end up with is an innovation across the transparency agenda, and open data will have fueled that. But it's a journey, as everybody said, and I know you're probably fed up of hearing that, and certainly we in the Open Data User Group take that flack every day on behalf of the agenda, because it's right. I wrote a blog on data.gov.uk as part of my new local authority initiative, which launches in DCLG next week, to say I wouldn't have believed it would have taken this long and the journey would have been so hard. But we do feel we're getting to a place where we're turning that corner. But I think part of it is not mobilising all the stakeholders. We've been able to do that for the people that are going to utilise open data and evidence the demand. But we've got multiple stakeholders across the piece. And IFG are in a unique position as an independent body doing what they do, who are not going to be affected by the churn of May 2015, to be able to be part of that ongoing agenda. And that's really why I was keen to be here today, because I think we've got to the point where the transparency agenda, the open data agenda, needs to move outside of those of us that are doing it, and we connect the other stakeholders, and then you'll see the changes that you want to see.
Thank you, Jacqui. And Tom.
Very quickly, really pleased about the sort of positive intentions set out by the Cabinet Office today in terms of standardised transparency clauses, other areas like that. The work that people like Jacqui and Ian do is absolutely fantastic and essential to taking it forward. When we publish something like this, as Ian already noticed, people come forward and say this information is different, that information is different. So we are hoping to improve this, and actually we're really grateful for an ongoing conversation with providers, departments, etc. And we'll probably do a re-release in a few weeks to improve further the quality of the data, and then another release next year perhaps. Let's see how it goes. So let's overwhelm the audience with data and see if they can interpret it. Meanwhile, the Institute will continue to sort of work on working with departments, trying to improve their approach to contracting more generally, and we hope we can contribute further in this area.
I'm really sorry, we are out of time, so we will conclude in a second. This is obviously a hugely important issue. It's clearly one that government is behind, business behind, and as we know, citizens care about this issue. They care about the information that they're getting, and they care about improving public services. So it's really important that we're all behind this, and that you all are interested in this and have passion in it as well as we do. Thank you very much indeed to the panel. Jacqui, Ed, Ollie, Tom, Ian. And also congratulations to the IFG and the Spend Network and Gavin and the team for the work on the report. Thank you very much, Will.